personal responsibility, safety, and somatics. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? Where do you live and work? And what are some of the equity questions that you are swirling on these days? What's been coming up for you?
First of all, what's happening? How we doing? My name is Dr. Pierce Gordon. I am calling to you from Brasesa, about 30 minutes north of Gaborone, Botswana. I am a lot of things, love researching, discussing, facilitating, and supporting discussions about transformation and liberation. And I'm so glad to connect with you today about many of our social change gripes, our issues. And the gripe that I've been holding is that many of the communities I've come to work with aren't healing enough to be leaders in equitable social change. That's the gripe that I've been thinking about a lot.
I'm curious, genuinely, like, is that a gripe that you have across like all groups of people, on the basis of race and ethnicity and culture and geography, like where we live and work and gender? Is this something that you see happening more in one group and less in another? Like who's not healing enough?
See, that's the thing, right? I can't say that it's everywhere, but it's been in every place that I've been a part of. I remember having a conversation with a whole bunch of design activists, and they were putting on a virtual convening, and there was a facilitator that discussed the importance of understanding what we all hold when doing social change work. And I've never heard it done this well. The question that people ask are, what brings us all together? Like all our issues, all our identities, and in many ways, all of the oppressions that we live, whether it's not me being a Black queer man living in Botswana, Black American man, whether it's when I was doing my grad school in the Oakland area, connected with folks in a lot of different identities and experiences. You have conversations around things like identity politics, from oppression Olympics, from how people try to gather power, and in many ways how they try and push other people down while doing so. And people always try to compare and contrast what they've gained, what their identity is, and what struggle they have. And the thing that really ties a lot of us together is the ways that we have experienced trauma in our own life or in our past that continues to define us. And that stayed with me for years and years now, because so many of our personal, organizational, and systemic experiences are based on the traumas that we identify with, whether it's slavery, whether it's issues of disenfranchisement, whether it's issues of being exposed as underdeveloped or a part of the global South or the like. There are countless experiences. So in many ways, the reason why we do social change is because we're trying to heal those traumas. But how can we heal the traumas on the outside if we haven't focused on how they've affected us on the inside? You understand?
Social change work can happen in any industry, in any kind of organization, right? Culture change, changing the climate, how things work inside of organizations. It doesn't matter if you're in private sector or social sector, philanthropy, government, et cetera.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
One of the things that I think, we've both noticed in our careers, much of which have been in the social impact sector, which tends to be nonprofits, global health, global development, philanthropy.
Yeah.
There are a lot of white folks. There are a lot of white folks with the title of leader, right? Yeah. They don't have the titles of doer. Most often they have the titles of leader. And so I'm curious, what kind of trauma you see in and among white folk, because they are the ones leading organizations. And I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like we're not experiencing a whole lot of movement. I mean, given how much time and money people are spending on addressing social issues, I feel like we should be a lot farther along, and we're not. And so what kinds of trauma are white folks hanging on to that's making it hard for us to move forward? Or maybe not move forward, right? Like move to a different place.
Right. It's a great question. We could talk about this for years. There are libraries filled with answering this topic in different backgrounds and experiences, I think.
Okay, but most people are not reading those books that are in libraries, unfortunately.
You're right. they're listening to podcasts and watching people on LinkedIn Live, right? A big quote that came to mind when I was like thinking about this problem is how so many people define leadership through the power that they hold instead of the agency they wield, right?
Ooh,
So
power they hold versus agency they wield.
right. So in specifically when it comes to folks that are at the center when dealing with an oppressive system. And you know what, we don't even have to, we should talk about white folks and folks in professional industries as we have worked and all, but we can also talk about other types of centrality oppression. Like for instance, I am an American living abroad, right?
Yeah.
And that comes with a certain amount of power and privilege of how I show up in spaces, right? In those environments, there's a system that I fall into that's not of my creation, that I have to take with me everywhere I go. When I speak up in places, when I write, when I communicate, when I try and learn Setswana, I know that people are treating me a different way. And when trying to enact change, especially when I was doing my PhD on the Botswana innovation ecosystem, it meant showing up differently in those environments. And especially when connecting with white folks about these issues, it's recognizing that a lot of these problems, people get into these issues because they recognize that there's a problem. And a lot of people we've had conversations with, when people cared about the words George Floyd and the like, they said that they thought that they were also a part of that problem, and they wanted to address it. So it takes a lot of inner work to recognize all of the privileges that you get, all of the power that you wield in those types of spaces, and work tirelessly with a system that's older than your grandparents to change a world that you benefit from. I remember one of the reasons why we were excited to connect with each other is because we're nerds of these topics, right? And when we facilitate spaces, we create ways for other people to expand their minds about how to move differently in the world when dealing with equity issues. And we talked about a book, Hospicing Modernity. Do you remember it?
I remember Hospicing Modernity.
Right. So I love it. I keep discussing it in all of my spaces. And among all of the things that the book tries to do, and saying there's different ways to show up in our world, it says, how do you hold spaces that make people reconcile with the happy privileges that the world allows us to engage in? And they suggest a resource, a method by Sharon Stein called Circular. They call it, it's an acronym of 8 expected intellectual, affective, and performative dispositional patterns. Big words, say with me. Point here is things you play into that the world lets you do that keeps modernity, sexism, racism, kyriarchy, all of these systems and structures moving because they're pleasurable. They move faster than thought, actually, and keep you able from building a world that's different. So it's some ideas, some points behind them. And in that acronym, it means you keep yourself innocent. Because I say I'm against violent systems, that means I'm no longer complicit in them. It means recentering yourself. How would this change affect me or make me feel? Certainty. I deserve to know exactly what's going to happen, when, where, and how. And also how we talked about this leadership. Either I or the person or group I designate is qualified and entitled to direct and determine the character of change. The people that we're a part of, white people, folks at the center, people that have a certain level of education, people that have a certain tax bracket, they are offered these patterns in thinking this is how change should be made. And the reason why change hasn't been making is those people are always at the center, making those decisions, and no one else.
I've been taking notes because you know that every time we're having a conversation, like my mind's like spinning even faster than it spins. Well, one of the things that came up for me when you said, we connected because we're nerds. I feel like the social impact sector, the culture change sector, doesn't always embrace nerds. And I'm thinking of this because my husband, my partner, has recently been learning machine learning, or maybe he already knows it and then he's learning some aspects of it. And there's like a book, yay thick, it's like 3 inches thick, that's just been kind of bouncing around the house. And anytime anybody comes over to our home, they ask me, they're like, who's doing machine learning here? And I'm like, well, obviously it's not me. But it's only my friends that are like, who's doing this learning, right? Because it's so common, I think, for folks that work in engineering, computer science to learn new coding languages, right? To teach themselves new things all the time, all the time. And I feel like that's not always the case in the social sector. We're still, we have some like Kellogg Foundation theory of change template that, folks have been using and evaluation consultants have been selling for like 30 years. Folks aren't like, hey, like I'm going to pick up hospicing modernity. Like it's a lot of really thick language and I'm going to wade through it. That's not happening. Like being a nerd isn't something that's always valued. It's like you're too smart, you're like a teacher's pet.
Yes, it is. Oh, we ain't a lot of us, but I think it's important to recognize in this work that there are many ways to learn from the world apart from people that just stick their noses into books. Yeah. Learning from the environments and experiences we've been a part of. There's learning from the people that have been a part of these spaces. There are learning from folks that haven't been, and recognizing every time you communicate with them, you have to communicate appropriately to recognize how they can engage with you and your work. And also recognizing that is, I think, a core point that you're hitting on isn't only that not a lot of people see themselves as nerds, but not a lot of people see the importance of bettering themselves through knowledge. There's limits on what feels like what you should be doing. Like you're finished once you have your degree, number one. Number two, it is an experience in many environments. The culture is competitive. You feel me? Like it's always about that you can get this grade or you can publish or perish this much more, instead of the practice of whether or not it's a book, whether it's a person, whether it's a bumblebee, whether it's a plant, whether it's having an experience. What will that entity, that knowledge that you now have in your brain, how can it support you being a better person and recognizing the divides that exist in this world? We keep talking about equity, right? So how will that knowledge support the change that you want to make in the future, and all of the ways that you can imbibe and utilize that, not because it makes you feel better, not because you matter here, but because the work we as an interconnected species deserve. We have a stewardship to make our world better because of our agency in the world, and knowledge is a core part of it.
Speaking of make the world better, there are two things that I read and heard yesterday that connect to this conversation, as well as, like the circular. Okay.
Tell me about it.
Okay. So the first one is, of course I listen to NPR like every good progressive Pacific Northwest dweller. And they were talking about water rights, and they were talking about water rights in California and how in the United States specifically, the older your water rights are, the more legitimate they are. And somebody was talking about, well, Native Americans, right? Like people that were already here, they're the ones that have the oldest water rights. And in this back and forth with, I think, somebody who like works in an environmental agency, they're like, yeah, but the settlers, I mean, he didn't use the language of settlers, but he essentially said, right, the settlers are the ones that have built infrastructure to harness the water and build reservoirs. And so that just really, that really struck, like that really stayed with me, this idea of, well, I've commodified it and right, like I've monetized it, and so it's mine, because when it was free, like that, right? So this thing around ownership. And the other thing that I read this morning was related to climate change, and apparently one of the President Bush's at a climate summit in the 90s, so it must have been the first one, said, we're not going to change our lifestyle. Whatever policies are going to be developed, whatever pacts are going to be made, it's not going to be at the cost of, American capitalists and like global capitalism taking a blow. Right, the wealthy Western world is not going to reduce emissions. We're not going to use less plastics. Like we're not going to change our lifestyle. And that really stayed with me. And it comes back to I think part of the framework that's in hospicing modernity around like, of course there's climate change, but I'm not going to do anything differently. Like I might donate to Oxfam, but I'm not gonna stop drinking, 20 cans of LaCroix a week. Like, I don't see that as pollution. And anyways, it just stuck with me.